This is episode 7 of the Creator-God Theory of the Atonement. I've titled it Tumbleweed Theories of the Atonement and 6 Criteria for Testing Such Theories. In this episode, we turn to the many theories of the atonement that have rolled across Christian history, attempts by scholars and theologians to explain what has long been labeled incomprehensible and unfathomable. Yet, across the centuries, many have tried to explain the inexplicable and comprehend the incomprehensible. And it is these very attempts that I call tumbleweed theories of the atonement. So let's turn to them now. Just as tumbleweeds appear large and formidable as they roll across the desert, these 7 tumbleweed theories of the atonement may also seem impressive, even conclusive when first encountered. Yet touch them, test them, and they crumble. Brittle, fragile, and rootless, breaking apart under the lightest pressure or slightest scrutiny. Why? Because every one of them is an attempt to explain the how of the atonement, and each fails to do so. At the heart of them all lies the same unanswerable question. How does the suffering, death, or sacrifice of Christ, the just, actually accomplish the salvation of mankind, the unjust? And how can such an act be just, necessary, and effective given its vicarious and infinite nature? That's the question every theory of the atonement has tried to answer. But if we break it down, it really comes to 2 questions that lie at the heart of it all. First, concerning the atonement's vicarious nature. How can the just die for the unjust and still be just? That's the moral question, the question of divine justice. Second, concerning the atonement's infinite nature. How can the infinite enter the finite and still remain infinite? That's the reality question, the question of how the infinite can act within a finite world without violating the laws that govern it. Together, these are the 2 great questions at the heart of the atonement. Every theory we're about to examine is an attempt to solve one or both, and every one of them, as we'll see, eventually collapses under scrutiny. Hence their designation as the tumbleweed theories of the atonement. The historical setting for these first 2 theories is the early church era, roughly between 100 and 500 AD. We begin with the ransom theory, whose core claim is that Christ's death paid a ransom to free humanity from bondage to sin or to Satan. In summary, the ransom theory is often seen as the oldest and most vivid of all atonement theories, imagining redemption as a cosmic transaction over the souls of men in which Christ's death is the ransom paid to free humanity from bondage. Closely related to the ransom theory, and often viewed as its refinement, is what became known as the Christus Victor theory. Where the ransom theory imagined a ransom paid in a cosmic transaction, the Christus Victor view reframed the atonement as a cosmic confrontation, a battle not a bargain. Its core claim is that Christ's death and resurrection conquered the powers of sin, death, and evil. In summary, this theory portrays the atonement as a cosmic victory, the triumph of divine power over the forces of sin, death, and darkness. With the passing of centuries, Christian thought moved from the drama of cosmic conflict to the order of divine law. By the time of the medieval church, roughly between 1000 and 1500 AD, the focus shifted from Satan's captivity of the souls of men to God's justice. Here we encounter Anselm's satisfaction theory, which became the defining view of the Middle Ages. Its core claim is that Christ's death satisfied God's offended honor and restored divine order. In summary, this theory shifted the focus from Satan to God's justice. Sin became a debt repaid to uphold divine honor. As theology moved into the Reformation era, roughly between 1500 and 1700 AD, the focus on divine justice intensified. The question was no longer about God's honor being satisfied, but about his law being upheld. Within this period, 2 related but distinct theories emerged. First, the penal substitution theory. Its core claim is that Christ bore the legal penalty of sin in humanity's place, satisfying divine justice. In summary, this theory turned the atonement into a courtroom exchange, the innocent punished, so the guilty might go free. As theology evolved, some reformers sought a middle ground between divine justice and divine mercy. The governmental theory emerged as that attempt, portraying God not as a legal judge enforcing penalties, but as a moral governor preserving the moral order of the universe. Its core claim is that Christ's suffering serves as a moral demonstration, upholding justice while making room for mercy, rather than as a legal substitution that pays sin's exact penalty. In summary, this theory saw God as moral governor, maintaining the moral order by balancing justice and mercy through Christ's atoning sacrifice. Not a legal transaction, but a moral demonstration of how justice and mercy can be harmonized. As theology entered the modern age, the focus of atonement theory shifted once again, this time from divine justice and the moral order to human transformation. The question was no longer how God satisfies justice, but how Christ's life and death transformed the human heart. Two influential theories emerged in this period. First, the moral influence theory, whose core claim was that Christ's life and suffering operate within a moral rather than a legal framework. In summary, this theory shifts the focus inward. The atonement changes hearts through moral influence and example, rather than by satisfying divine justice. Building on the moral influence theory, the scapegoat theory narrows the focus to one of humanity's deepest moral failings, the scapegoating ethos. It calls humanity to abandon the cycle of accusation and blame, revealing that God stands not with the accusers but with the accused, that divine love does not scapegoat but redeems. Its core claim is that the atonement reveals and dismantles the human cycle of scapegoating. And in summary, this theory presents Christ as the innocent victim, exposing humanity's pattern of accusation, vengeance, and sin, unmasking the scapegoating ethos, and revealing divine love as redemptive. Across 2 millennia, these 7 tumbleweed theories of the atonement have rolled across Christian history, each claiming to explain how the atonement works, yet each eventually collapsing under scrutiny. The truth is, while every theory has claimed legitimacy, and many contain a nugget of truth, none have ultimately held up under scrutiny. Time and again, each one collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, giving rise to the next theory that tries to offer a truer account of how the atonement works. Some sound profound, even sacred, yet if they violate the eternal laws of reality or the moral laws of justice, they can't stand. That's why I've created what I call a reality-based checklist, 6 non-negotiable laws and principles that together form the ultimate test of any atonement theory. If a theory breaks even one of them, it fails the test. It becomes another tumbleweed theory, blown about by speculation and ready to crumble under the slightest pressure or scrutiny. From this point forward, this checklist will be our primary standard of truth. If a theory passes this test, it stands. If it violates any one of these 6 criteria, it falls. No exceptions. Let's start with the first 3 criteria. These deal with the vicarious nature of the atonement, focusing on justice and the moral principles we've discussed before. The innocence principle. It is unjust to punish the innocent. No legitimate theory can justify punishing the innocent. Justice, by definition, protects innocence, not condemns it. To punish the innocent is to overturn the very foundation of moral law. The substitution principle. It is unjust to punish a substitute. Substitution raises the same problem. It is unjust to punish one person in place of another. Justice requires that every soul answer for its own sins, not transfer guilt or penalty to a stand-in. The prospective principle. It is unjust to punish future sins. Punishing for sins not yet committed breaks justice entirely. It condemns choices before they exist and people before they act. Justice is forward-facing, not preemptive. Each of these principles reflects moral law and eternal justice. Punishing the innocent, punishing a substitute, or punishing future sins, all 3 are violations of this moral law. And if a theory of the atonement requires us to violate even one of these 3 principles, it cannot be legitimate. So those are the moral and justice principles tied to the atonement's vicarious nature. But the checklist doesn't stop there. The atonement is also described as infinite and eternal, and that raises another set of questions. Here, the concern isn't justice, but the very structure of reality itself, identity, agency, and causality. Let's look at the final three criteria on the checklist, which deal with the atonement's infinite nature. Backward causation. Violating causality is untenable. Backward causation claims that future sins caused Christ's suffering in the past, but this flips cause and effect upside down. No reality can be built on effects that come before their causes. Calvinistic determinism. Denying agency is untenable. Determinism assumes all choices are fixed by God's foreknowledge. But without agency, intelligences are no longer intelligences. To deny free will is to destroy the very identity of moral beings. Finite infinity. Anything but a potential infinity is untenable. A proper understanding of infinity means without limit. It cannot be fixed, finished, or contained. A finite infinity is a contradiction in terms. Only a potential infinity is coherent, endless in scope, never complete, never actualized, but always unfolding without limit. Each of these criteria reflects a violation of the eternal structure of reality itself, flipping cause and effect, denying agency, or turning infinity into a contradiction. And if a theory of the atonement requires us to violate any one of these three laws, the laws of identity, agency, and causality, it cannot be legitimate. Observe how the 6 criteria above serve to disqualify any theory of the atonement that proves unjust or untenable, not by definition, but by reality itself. A single violation collapses the theory against the reality-based structure of existence. Hence, it fails the very reality-based checklist by which all theories are tested. And remember, a theory doesn't need to violate all 6 to fail the test. To violate even one is violation enough to disqualify it. I won't be testing all 7 theories in detail, but we'll look closely at 2 of the most familiar to show the general pattern. First, the ransom theory, which clearly disqualifies itself as a legitimate theory by violating the foundational principles of justice. Second, the satisfaction theory, which also disqualifies itself not only for violating those same principles of justice, but for becoming entangled in the paradoxes and perplexities of an infinite atonement. By scrutinizing these 2 tumbleweed theories against our 6 criteria, we'll establish the pattern that prepares us to explore the Creator-God theory and how it ultimately resolves these long-standing contradictions. Let's begin with the ransom theory. The ransom theory, one of the earliest attempts to explain how the atonement works, originated in the early church era with Origen of Alexandria. Origen taught that humanity, through the fall, became enslaved to Satan. To free mankind, God paid a ransom through the death of Christ. Satan accepted the price, but Christ's resurrection defeated him, turning the exchange into a dramatic cosmic rescue. It sounds heroic, and it draws from biblical verses that speak of Christ being sent to give his life a ransom for many, and who gave himself a ransom for all, as well as believers being bought with a price. But when tested, it quickly collapses. It's worth noting that theologians have long recognized several major problems with the ransom theory, even apart from questions of justice. Let's start with those general objections. First, it implies that God bargains with the devil, violating divine sovereignty by placing God and Satan on equal footing. Second, it suggests that God deceives the devil, violating divine integrity by not honoring his own bargain. These 2 objections alone have led many to question the theory's credibility. If God is truly sovereign, he does not negotiate with evil. If he is perfectly truthful, he does not deceive. But now let's go beyond these well-known objections to a third, the most serious of all. This theory makes Christ himself the ransom, and here the ransom theory completely collapses. When tested against the first 3 criteria on our reality-based checklist, the principles of justice, it fails immediately. If Christ is the ransom, then the innocent is punished in place of the guilty, violating both the innocence and substitution principles. And since the ransom supposedly covers all humanity, past, present, and future, it also violates the prospective principle by punishing for sins yet to be committed. At this point, the theory fails the reality-based test, and there is no need to proceed to the remaining criteria in our checklist. In the end, the ransom theory cannot stand. It fails for three reasons. First, it undermines divine sovereignty. Second, it corrupts divine integrity. And third, it violates all three principles of justice. Therefore, the ransom theory is unjust, untenable, and illegitimate, just another among the many tumbleweed theories of the atonement that have failed to explain how the atonement actually works. Following the collapse of the ransom theory, a new model arose in the medieval era, the satisfaction theory, championed by Anselm of Canterbury around the 12th century. Anselm sought to correct the flaws of the ransom model by shifting the problem from humanity's bondage to Satan through sin and death to God's dishonored majesty. Drawing from the feudal world he lived in, Anselm imagined God as a great lord whose honor had been violated by human sin. Just as a feudal lord demanded satisfaction for disobedience, Anselm taught that God demanded satisfaction for sin, not as payment to Satan, but as restitution to his own divine honor. But there was a problem. God is infinite, and humanity is not. No finite offering could satisfy an infinite offense. Anselm reasoned, therefore, that only one who was both God and man could make satisfaction infinite in worth, yet human in representation. He drew support for his satisfaction theory from passages like Isaiah 53, where God shall see the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied, and 1 John 2, and he is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. These verses were read to mean that sin dishonored God's majesty, and that Christ's obedient sacrifice restored divine order by satisfying justice. It sounds logical, even noble, but when tested against the 6 reality-based criteria, the theory collapses. When we test the satisfaction theory against the first 3 justice principles, it fails immediately. If Christ's sacrifice is meant to satisfy God's offended honor, then once again, the innocent is punished for the guilty, violating the innocence and substitution principles. And since this satisfaction is said to cover all humanity, past, present, and future, it also violates the prospective principle, punishing for sins yet to be committed. But that's only half the problem. Unlike the ransom theory, which fails on moral and vicarious grounds, the satisfaction theory also collapses under the weight of the atonement's infinite nature. It violates the law of causality through backward causation, making the effect precede the cause, as Christ atones for sins yet to be committed. It denies moral agency through Calvinistic determinism, raising the question, if Christ has already suffered for sins not yet committed, are those sins freely chosen or predestined? And it misconceives infinity itself, treating the infinite atonement's reach as a completed actuality, rather than a without-limit potentiality, resulting in the absurdity of a finite infinity. So the satisfaction theory fails on both fronts, its vicarious and infinite nature. It merely replaces one set of problems with another, from bargaining with Satan to bargaining with divine honor. In doing so, it violates the very principles it was meant to defend, justice, agency, and causality, and misconceives the infinite nature of the atonement as a completed actuality rather than as a without-limit potentiality. Thus, like its predecessor, the satisfaction theory is unjust, untenable, and illegitimate, another tumbleweed theory that collapses under scrutiny. For future reference, it may help to pause here and distinguish between the 2 natures of the atonement, its finite actuality and its infinite potentiality, so there's no confusion later. The satisfaction theory's critical error lies right here. It treats that infinite potentiality as though it were a finite actuality, collapsing the infinite into the finite and producing the contradiction of a finite infinity. To correct this error, think of it this way. First, its vicarious nature represents its finite actuality, what Christ actually accomplished in Gethsemane and on the cross. Second, its infinite nature represents its infinite potentiality, its eternal reach and redemptive power extending without limit, never exhausted, or complete in scope or duration. As we turn to part 2 of the Creator-God theory of the atonement, The significance of these two distinctions will become much clearer. For now, simply keep them in mind as we move forward. We've now completed our investigation of the 7 tumbleweed theories of the atonement, focusing especially on the ransom and satisfaction theories, to show how each fails our reality-based checklist, violating one or more of its core criteria and proving illegitimate. This brings part 1, the problem, to a close. In this first part, we introduced the background story leading to the atonement crisis, explored the 5 W's and the how, exposed the problems and more problems surrounding that how, and asked why so many Latter-day Saints respond, "Problems? What problems?" We then showed why that blind spot matters, how ignoring the how opens the door to distortions and more distortions across Christian thought, reshaping our understanding of doctrines like divine love itself. Finally, in this episode, we examine the long history of failed explanations, the tumbleweed theories of the atonement that collapse under scrutiny and perpetuate those distortions. All of this has been preparation for part 2, the solution, where we turn to the Creator-God theory of the atonement, beginning with episode 8. There we'll explore how this theory resolves every one of these long-standing contradictions and finally answers the question that others have avoided, replacing the familiar, somehow, with a clear and reality-based, "Here's how."